Today, we want to look at the introduction to the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. The first thing we look at the composition and the source of the book of Matthew. Book of Matthew, we are divided into 12 subtopics. The first, the infancy narrative of Jesus, that talks about who and where of Jesus. You can see it in Matthew chapter 1, 1 to 2, 1 to chapter 2 to the last verse, which is 23. Matthew chapter 1 to chapter 2, end in verse 23. Then the second one, the beginning of Jesus' activity. I call it the beginning of Jesus' ministry. You see that in Matthew chapter 3 to chapter 4. Then the Sermon on the Mount. Then the eighth, which is the eighth beatitude, Matthew chapter 5 to 1, verse 1. Then chapter 7, 29. It started from Matthew chapter 5. Then end in chapter 7. We look at the third one, the fourth one, which is the Jesus powerful deeds. That is Jesus' manifestation of God's nature in humanity, thereby serving them. Matthew 8 to Matthew chapter 9. Then a missionary discourse of Jesus. That is Jesus outpouring the word. Jesus pouring the word in order to impart the word and transform it within to make ready the further mission of his apostles and the reign of God's kingdom on earth. See that on Matthew chapter 10. Then another one is the rejection, which is the sixth one, the rejection of Jesus, Matthew 11 to Matthew chapter 12. Chapter 11 to Matthew chapter 12, end in verse 50. Then the parable of the kingdom, the seventh one, Matthew 13, 1 to 53. Look at the miracles, controversies on the cross. See that in the same Matthew chapter 13, from verse 54 to 17, ending verse 27. We see also the ninth one, the advice to a divided community. Matthew 18, reading from verse 1 to 35. Then opposition to Jesus. See that in Matthew 19 to Matthew 23, and in verse 29. The 11th one, the coming of the kingdom. Matthew 24, verse 1, and in Matthew chapter 25, verse 46. Then the last one, which is the 12th one, Jesus' death and resurrection. See that in Matthew 26, verse 1, and in Matthew 28, verse 20. Then look at the Matthew's Gospel is generally considered to be revision or second edition of Mark's Gospel. Most of the material in the 6th chapter of Mark is included in Matthew. Yet, Matthew did not mostly copy his source. Rather, he edited Mark freely and joined it with material from a collection of Jesus' saying, which we use the word kill, that is kule, and the material peculiar to Matthew. So in this case, it's trying to tell us that the book of Matthew is being derived from the book of Mark. And one will be asking, why is it that Matthew is first and he try to get, or the source of it is from Mark, trying to get some of the sayings of Mark. Yes, the book of Mark was written first because Mark is ascribed to Peter, the successor of Christ. So when the Christians were listening to Peter's preaching, some demanded the write-up of all the things that Peter preached. So Peter decided to choose Mark as his secretary. By then, in the Jewish context, we call them the scribes. That is why you see scribes in the Bible. They are the writers. Okay. Then Matthew compressed the accounts in Mark to include only what he considered essential and frequently turned narration into dialogue. In the first part of the gospel, Matthew did not follow the Markan sequence very closely. Okay, so if you read in chapter 1 to 12, you see that it is somehow quite different from the book of Mark. So he didn't follow Mark sequence in accordingly. But from Matthew 13 onward, he observes Mark's outline more carefully. Okay, we look at the setting. Matthew may likely wrote his gospel after AD 70, and in or near Palestine. His work must be viewed as an attempt to respond to the crisis posed by the Jerusalem temple's destruction. Then here, this siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, this problem started in 1960, but in 1970, that is when they was able to siege the Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, or the Jerusalem temple. The siege of Jerusalem lasted about 6 months until September AD 70. So they started from in that AD. It lasted 6 months, which means they started something like a March of the siege, but the plan started in AD 60. Okay, take notice of it. The destruction of Jerusalem, the first destruction before it was rebuilt. The siege came to an end on September 8th, AD 70, with the defeat of the factions and the utter destruction of the city. What were early Christians doing during the Jewish war is a question. What are they doing? Now, listen. All we know comes from the earlier church historians, Eusebius, who claims that an oracle directed the members of the Jerusalem church to leave the city before the war began, or to settle in Pera, a city east of the Jordan in Decapolis. This report is accurately not reliable because we do not know whereabouts of other Christians outside of Jerusalem may have done or how they reacted to the events during the war. So we are going to end here for today. I'll make the video that you will be able to see or hear more or know more about the whereabouts of the Christians. So, and may God bless you as you listen and as you are following up. We thank all those who have been following up. But mind you that this introduction is just like the first step to our Bible study. By the grace of God, we are going to interpret or analyze every chapter verses by verses to the end of it. So get yourself ready. Remain blessed.